Recession proof. Is there such a thing? If there is, does the Toronto real estate market fit into that category? Stay tuned to this week's episode of Prime Property. Promise you, it's going to get controversial. Good day, Toronto. Welcome to another episode of Prime Property. So glad you could join us here. Oh boy, January flew by really fast. There's been so many new things that we're building on the team right now to kind of help you guys out with your Toronto real estate investing. So time has really flew by. But thankfully, I took down the Christmas tree last week. Oh boy, yeah, we're one of those households. But the house is back into shape. There's no more Christmas trees in the living room. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about why Toronto might be as close to recession-proof as possible. Now, I've always kind of want to talk about this in a video, but I was always kind of afraid to be permanently labeled a super bullish person, especially because I'm in the real estate world selling real estate. However, as I had some time to reflect while I was away, I told myself, why not? I should give my 2 cents on it since I feel so strongly about it. And if you find these videos helpful, make sure you give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the Prime Property channel. Much appreciated if you do that because it'll help us promote our video out there and our messages to other people who are looking for how to financially benefit from the Toronto real estate market. Thank you. Now, I don't believe in absolute certainty as anything could really happen, but Toronto real estate market has a lot of upside going for it that makes it almost as recession-proof as possible, relatively speaking. Here's some factors to make me more bullish on the market than I've ever been. Number one being population. I've talked a lot about that. Number two, availability of credit, which is mortgages. Number three, the creation of jobs. I've talked about Toronto turning into Maple Valley, which is Canada's Silicon Valley. For today's videos, I'm going to talk about one, population, and two, the availability of credit. One, our population growth for the amount of people we have is absolutely absurd. I've talked about it many times before. I've written about it many times before. But today I'm going to put a different spin on it to elaborate further for you. Canada gets so many immigrants for how small of a country we actually are. Also, the new immigrants that come in, we have a new process for how we screen them, and it's so much more rigid, and it's based on this economic output that you read in the Canada website. In other words, basically, the more taxes you pay, or if you bring more money to the country, the more likelihood of Canada is going to allow you to become a citizen. Basically meaning that people coming into the city or in the country are really rich or have jobs that make them on the higher end of the working class. Now, many people compare our immigration numbers to our neighbors down south, to the US, and simply kind of just dismiss how little immigration that we get, as you can see over here, relatively speaking to the US. However, you really have to compare apples to apples, okay? You can see over here on the chart on the right, I circled in purple, the number of immigrants, although it's very low, when you compare it to the proportion of the population, we are 5% higher than the US. So Canada's at about 21%, which is a 5% higher than 15.5% of the US. Now, another way to look at this metric is the number of immigrants that come into the country per capita. So you can see on this other table, you can see every 1,000 Canadian citizens, that we're forecasted to have 6.6 new immigrants come in. Compared to US's, for every 1,000, they get about 2.9. So therefore, we're effectively doubling the immigration rate than the US, but just by population alone. Another thing to add on to all of this is most immigrants who come to Canada land in Ontario. Okay, think about it. In US, there's so many places you can go, but on Canada, you can really think about 3 major cities if you're trying to make a living. It's either Vancouver, Calgary, or Toronto. Now, if you're bilingual, you can probably make it in Montreal. So that's why so many people flood Ontario. And when they land here in Ontario, where do you think they're going to go? Greater Toronto area. That's why the population in Toronto is expected to double by 2040 because of this reason. The immigration that comes in is absolutely insane. So with the population going to double, if our real estate supply doesn't match the amount of immigrants coming in, what do you think is going to happen to prices? We have really wealthy people or have the ability to make a lot of money coming into Toronto. They're going to want to buy real estate and we don't have enough supply. That's just going to drive the prices up. So that's why I'm very bullish and why I say Toronto may be recession-proof because of that one metric alone. The second reason why Toronto is fairly recession-proof, by my opinion, is the availability of credit. Now, we all talked about the stress test before. We all say either you love it or you don't. But what I will say is, despite how much negative press is against it, there is in one way that is positive, and it's the fact that we're over-qualifying applicants for mortgages, meaning that should there be a recession, there's a little bit of buffer that they will still be able to pay their mortgages. However, I'm not talking about that today. We're going to take a little spin on credit availability and we're going to talk about delinquency rates, or what we call default rates. So in Canada, I'm going to put a chart up over here. It shows how likely Canadians are going to default on their mortgage. Default meaning not pay their mortgage. And you can see that right now we're at a very, 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 very low 0.24% default rate in Canada. Now that means 1 in 4,000 mortgages are actually going to default in Canada. Now when you look even closer in Ontario specifically, we're at 0.09%. That means 1 in 11,000 mortgages are going to default. 1 in 11,000. It looks like we Ontarionian? It looks like people in Ontario really, really want to keep their houses. So when you compare that to our counterparts down south, which I keep measuring against, their default rate is at 27 times higher than ours or 10 times higher than Canada because their rate is at 2.45%. 2.45. That's a lot. And the reason why I bring this up is, and why it's important is because if a recession were to happen, and there's likely going to happen because people always talk about it, but there's always going to be something on the horizon. If the availability of credit is reduced, the numbers show us that there's more emphasis in Ontario and Canada to keep our houses through the rough time. The mortgages in Ontario and Canada are less likely to end in default, meaning that there aren't going to be as many houses that get put into foreclosure and put on the market. Because when you look at the default rates in 2008, which is ultimately what caused the US recession, because the mortgages weren't backed by anything substantial as collateral. Now, if the recession were on the horizon, specifically numbers in the charts I just showed you, I mapped out where 2008 was during the US recession because ultimately that was caused by mortgages not being backed by anything substantial. So when you look at those numbers that I purposely mapped out in 2008, you can see that Canada wasn't really too affected by the recession. And Toronto market was still fairly strong, just kept kind of moving along. The default rate in Canada was only about 0.33%. We're at 0.24% right now. And during the recession, it was at 0.33%. Yeah, so the default rate wasn't that much higher in 2008 than it is now. In comparison to the US, the default rate was at almost 8%. That's almost 2.5 times more in US than it was in Canada at the time. That means 1 in 12.5 mortgages were defaulting in US in 2008. That is some perspective for you. As opposed to Canada in 2008, 1 in 3,000 mortgages were defaulting in Canada. Now that's some perspective for you. Another interesting fact that I want to highlight to you is the amount of equity that the average Canadian owns is about 74% according to Purview. Purview is this tool most mortgage brokers use to check on mortgages, and it has stats, and it says 74% that's the amount of equity most Canadians have in their home. Now there's two ways you can look at this. You can look at it as 74% of the market value right now, meaning that they own 74% of what the house is worth, or alternatively, they already paid off 74% of their mortgage, which ultimately comes down to both metric says that the average Canadian owns more of the house than the bank does, which is great because if a recession were to happen, are you likely to lose the other 74% of the house that you own or just continue paying along because you already have that much equity in your home? So if you think about it, even if a recession comes with the low delinquency rate and default rates, Canadians own so much of their home that they're likely going to find ways and scrap money around to pay off their mortgages to make sure they still own that home. So does that make us recession proof? The way I look at it is the world is super chaotic right now. It's kind of like a storm. Toronto is in the storm, but right in the middle of the storm, the eye of the storm, where it's the calmest. Everything is humming and going, and even though there's chaos all around us, the Toronto real estate market is nice, calm, steady, and peaceful. So do I think we're kind of recession proof? There's a very likelihood if a recession were to happen, I think we'll survive, but only time will tell. As long as you buy cash flowing positive properties, you're going to be able to survive a recession and also benefit from the rising tide that is the Toronto real estate market. With the population booming, a very, very likelihood of people defaulting on their mortgage and people owning so much at home, what do you think is going to happen to prices in the next 10 years? If this is something you want to benefit from in 2020, click on the link below where we show you how to buy the correct cash flow positive properties to take advantage of this almost, maybe recession proof market that is Toronto. Hope this helps, guys. Until next time, happy real estating. Now that you're done watching this one, how about this one? Oh, you know what? This one's good too. Ooh, this one's really good. You know what? Just watch them both.